Hi, welcome back to Let's Get Lit. In today's video, we're going to go over Chapter 1 of The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. So, I hope you're ready to travel with me back to the 1920s and see the Gilded Age of America. Wait, something's not quite right. Hold on. That's right. Okay, let's do this. So, Chapter 1 starts out with our narrator, Nick Caraway. He explains that when he was little, his dad gave him some advice that he would hold forever. That advice was, whenever you feel like criticizing someone, just remember that they haven't had all the advantages that you had. And throughout his life, Nick kept this motto. That is, till he met Gatsby. So we learned that our narrator is from a prominent, well-to-do family in the Midwest. We also learned that his family is from the descendants of the Dukes of Buloc. I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly. His grandfather's brother came to America in 1851 and started a wholesale hardware store that his father currently owned. We also learned that our narrator graduated New Haven in 1915 and that he's also a World War I veteran. He came back from the war. He got really bored of the Midwest, so he decided that he was going to move to New York City and become a bondsman, and that was in the spring of 1922. Nick goes on to tell the reader that when he moves out to New York, he's supposed to rent a small bungalow with a fellow colleague of his, but unfortunately that colleague had to move to Washington, so Nick ends up renting the bungalow all by himself. Shortly after he arrives, an older gentleman asks him directions through the city. He tells the reader this feels good because he wants to start his life over. He wants to start anew in New York, and by someone asking him for directions, he's starting to feel like he's becoming a local. We then learn that spring gives way to summer, and that during the summer, this is where the main plot of the story begins. Nick tells us that in between spring and summer, he bought a bunch of books about banking to try to be the best bondsman he could be. Everything from Midas to Morgan, the Mycenaeans, you name it, he bought it and tried to study up on it. He also tells us that he once wrote for the Yale News, and that he wants to become a well-rounded man in society. Nick also informs the reader that he lives on Long Island, and that there are two eggs to this island. There's the West Egg, where he lives, where it's less fashionable. It's newer money. And then you have East Egg, the wealthy old money of the city that they don't know what to do with. But he does state that on West Egg, right next door in fact, is a huge mansion. This mansion is inspired by the Hotel de Ville in Normandy. It has a tower on one side, it's got a beard of ivy everywhere, and a marble swimming pool no less. Also, the ground spans 40 acres of lawn and garden. This mansion is owned by Mr. 1J Gatsby. He tells the reader, again, that East Egg is where all the money's at. So one evening, he's driving to East Egg to meet up with Daisy and Tom Buchanan. Daisy is his second cousin once removed. Tom, he knows from college. In college, Tom was this huge football star, highly popular. Everyone loved him. After the war, when Nick came back, he decided to spend a few days in Chicago with them, just to catch up and say hi. And now he was going back, since they live on East Egg, and he now lives in West, to go visit and have dinner. Nick then describes Tom and Daisy's house to the reader, and it is incredible how their backyard stretched for a quarter of the mile from the water's edge to the huge row of glass windows in the back of their house. He also notes that when he went to meet them for dinner, Tom was still in his riding clothes. Nick explains how Tom looks. Tom is a hard-looking man with shiny, arrogant eyes and established dominance on his face and the appearance of an always leaning aggressively forward person. He mentions that not even his effeminate riding clothes could hide his enormous body full of huge muscles and strength. Nick mentions that when Tom moves his shoulder, you can see every muscle in his arm move under his clothes. Then we get on to Tom's speaking voice, which is a gruff husk of a voice, to match all of his physical physique. While they were not close in school, Tom always gave the impression that he approved of Nick and he wanted Nick to like him. He was always trying to get Nick's approval. Tom takes him by the arm and ushers him into the house. As we're entering the house, as they're making their way to this huge room where all the French windows are, we can see the billowing curtains all around the room. and he mentions that the curtains were white and looks like large pale flags twisting and rippling in the wind. And he also comments that the only stationary object in the room was this enormous couch where two women were anchored. Tom then goes to the windows and shuts all of them, where the wind dies out and the curtains stay motionless. Nick notes that one of the girls, Daisy, his cousin, and the other was a stranger. Daisy then grabs his hand and lets Nick know that she is paralyzed with happiness. She's excited to see him. Nick comments how Daisy's voice is very sing-songy and has a way of keeping everyone who's listening to it interested in what she's saying. Everyone hangs on every word she says. Nick also mentions to Daisy that as he was traveling east to New York City, he stopped in Chicago where everyone was dying to know how Daisy was doing. Daisy insists that everyone goes back to Chicago tomorrow so they can reconnect with everyone who's there. Then quickly changes her mind and says, "You ought to see my baby." As Nick and Daisy are talking about the baby, Tom then wraps his arm around Nick and changes the conversation. Tom asks, what is Nick doing in New York? And Nick lets him know that he is becoming a bondsman now. Tom says he's never heard of a bondsman or what they do. Nick responds that if he stays in the East long enough, he will know for sure what a bondsman is. So Tom says he's planning on staying in the East for the rest of his life. At this point, the stranger who we learn is actually called Miss Baker. And Miss Baker agrees with Tom about staying in the East. It's the most fashionable place to stay. As Miss Baker says this, she starts to stand up and complains that she is so stiff from laying on the couch. As she's standing and talking, Nick realizes that he has seen her somewhere before, but he's not quite sure. Miss Baker is a slender, small-breasted woman with a very proper pose. As Nick is describing her, she notates that Nick lives in West Egg and asks if he knows anyone there. Nick says that he doesn't, but Miss Baker asks, does he know Mr. Gatsby? Daisy asks, who's Gatsby? But before Nick can answer, the dinner is announced. They all move outside onto the porch where there's a long table set up with candles. Daisy asks why candles when it's just 2 weeks until the longest day of the year. They jump from topic to topic in a very easygoing manner. Daisy talks about planning something for the longest day of the year, how Tom hurt her knuckle. She calls him a brute with a hulking physique. Tom objects to being called a brute. He hates it, but Daisy insists that he's hulking. Throughout dinner, Nick notices the differences from dinners in the East to dinners in the Midwest. He talks about how dinners in the East are very easygoing and effortless and just flows from one point to the next, whereas dinners in the Midwest are very uptight. It's very strict, very harsh, very uptight atmosphere for dinners. Nick makes the comment that Daisy makes him feel uncivilized, jokingly. Nick says this after watching Daisy and Miss Baker talk. When Nick says this to Daisy, Tom butts in and states that civilization is going into pieces. Tom states that he's starting to become a pessimist about everything going on and asks if Nick has read The Rise of the Colored Empire. Tom then starts to discuss the difference between classes and different races of people. As Tom begins to try and make his point about the different races of people, Daisy keeps shooting him down or tries to play him off of the discussion in a very lighthearted manner. Nick mentions that the more Tom gets into this subject, the more pathetic he seems. As Tom starts to become more passionate about the subject, inside we start to hear a telephone ring. One of the butlers goes inside and answers it. And as he leaves, Daisy explains the butler's past to Nick. And the butler comes back out and whispers something into Tom's ear. Tom then pushes his chair back and goes into the house to answer the phone. When Tom is left, Daisy remarks that she loves to see Nick at her house. Daisy then throws her napkin on the table and excuses herself and goes inside. When only Miss Baker and Nick are left, they exchange a short glance. As Nick tries to speak, she shushes him. Miss Baker lets Nick know that Tom has a woman in New York. Miss Baker adds that she might have the decency not to telephone at dinner time. Before Nick fully grasps the situation of what's going on, Daisy and Tom are back at the table. Light conversation is trying to be made. Tom mentions that after dinner he would like to take Nick to the stables. But then the telephone rings again from inside. They let it ring and then it goes silent. After dinner, Tom and Miss Baker go back inside while Daisy and Nick are on the veranda. Nick and Daisy begin to talk, and Daisy states that Nick did not go to her wedding. Nick let her know that he was still in the war when that happened. Nick tries to make small conversation about her child, and Daisy tells Nick about her birth. We learned that when Daisy had her child, Tom was nowhere to be seen. When Daisy woke up from giving birth, she asked the nurse if her child was a boy or a girl. When the nurse told her it was a girl, she turned and she wept. Then she stated that she's glad it was a girl, and that she hoped she would be a fool, and that the best thing in the world for a girl to be is a beautiful little fool. Daisy goes on to state that she thinks everything is just terrible. While Daisy is talking, Nick feels the real sense of unease from everything that she stated, almost as if she's trying to elicit a certain reaction from Nick. When she finishes, she looks at Nick with a certain look that lets him know his thoughts were correct. We then go back inside the large room from earlier. Tom and Miss Baker sit at either end of the long couch, and she reads aloud from the Saturday Evening Post. Once Daisy and Nick entered the room, Miss Baker stops reading the paper. She remarks that it's 10 o'clock and it's time for her to go to bed. Daisy states that Jordan is going to play in the tournament tomorrow. When Daisy says this, Nick instantly realizes that Miss Baker was in fact Miss Jordan Baker. Nick realized that he knew her face, and it was because he'd seen her pictures in Sporting Lives at Asheville, in Hot Springs, and in Palm Beach. Miss Baker says goodnight and to wake her up at 8 o'clock. She then says goodnight to Mr. Caraway and that she'll see him soon. Daisy says of course you will. Daisy also makes light conversation that if Nick comes around often, she's going to fling Nick and Miss Baker together and try to push them towards marriage. Then Miss Baker leaves the room. After she's gone, Tom comments that she's a very nice girl. Tom asks what Daisy and Nick had talked about while on the veranda. Tom asks if Daisy and Nick had a little heart-to-heart. Daisy, as if making a joke, says that she can't remember, but she thinks they talked about the Nordic race. And in fact, she was sure of it. Tom then says, "Don't believe everything you hear." Nick insists that he had heard nothing at all, and a few minutes later he gets up and goes home. Then they go out the door with him and stood beside his car. As he's getting in and starting the car, Daisy and Tom says that they have heard rumors that he's engaged. Daisy insists that she heard it and that it must be true. And with this, it just made Tom laugh. Nick assures the reader that he knows what's going on and lets the reader know that there were rumors from the Midwest that he was in fact engaged, but he reassures the reader that he is not engaged. He is single, and that is that. Nick then talks about his drive back home. He parks his car in the shed and then goes to sit out on his little lawn. He notes that as he's sitting on his lawn, he sees Mr. Gatsby out on his lawn looking out at the dock towards East Egg. Nick wants to call out to Mr. Gatsby, but doesn't because he's too intimidated. When Nick looks up, he realizes that Mr. Gatsby has vanished. This is the end of Chapter 1. Tune in next time as we go over Chapter 2 of The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. I hope you guys have a great day, and remember, always stay lit.